This video will be about the subject of old firearms in the 1880s, and not their evolution, but the difficulty in looking up certain things. Intermittently, I'll be covering the rabbit holes that failed. In the United States, part of the laws that we have existent are based on laws justified by taxes. This is one of the few examples of that really being the only reason they exist, or at least that's what is claimed, using taxing as an excuse to regulate things on a federal level only. The Gun Control Act of 1968 and the National Firearms Act of 1934. The 1934 one was for regulating away handguns, and 1968 had to do with a bunch of rules concerning a bunch of people right after or thereabouts after the death of John F. Kennedy, among many things. Regulation by the ATF can include anything that's imported that's even vaguely related. International commerce. ATF letters that are put out are not laws or permanent decisions. They can change their mind at any time. In fact, they've been caught doing this where they tell someone that they think something is completely legal, and then after they find out the person's gone ahead and done exactly what they were told they were allowed to do, immediately prosecuted them by trying to create a new rule. Firearms made before or designed before 1898 are generally considered or are explicitly considered excluded from any rules the ATF or the federal government has, unless otherwise noted. They can always make a new one. And this includes any antique firearm design that you make a new copy of. It's based on what it does, not when it was made. There are variations of this, however, where some of them are any gun made before a certain date, but any gun after that cannot. And it has to be explicitly written on it. If it's not serial numbered or named and dated, then they just assume it's a reproduction, and that's not acceptable. But those are the exceptions. I can make a replica muzzle loader, matchlock, flintlock, percussion cap, or similar type of ignition system-based gun if I want to. You're now aware of those types, and many more like them. They're based on the idea that you have a completely sealed metal tube, that's the barrel, that at one end is completely sealed except for a pathway for something limiting, like the hot gases from a primer, or for you putting in literally a fuse on a cannon. And that makes it to where it's not effective as a repeating firearm. They're defined as non-repeating firearms. Now, because of that being an aspect of it, the ATF has decided that anything that is a low effectiveness gun, any firearm, like you and I would think of it as, that cannot be fired rapidly, reloaded easily, be reliable during a hunting trip, those are considered excluded not because they're less dangerous, but because they're slower to reload. If you create a speed loader for a muzzle loader, they will decide they're going to regulate it, except this is the thing. They'll interpret muzzle loader as including a gun that not only has the primer, which is just a cap on the back, but they'll also allow for guns that did exist where you'd shove the bullet in one end and then there was a constriction there, and then there's a chamber in the back for propellant, and then you put a primer on it. They have effectively a breech load for the propellant and primer, because the primer was always breech-based, and the bullet had to go in from the muzzle. There was also versions of this that were excluded that had the bullet drop in here, and the propellant here, and a primer here, on a mechanism that would let you speed reload. Yes, this existed, a rapid reloading muzzle loader. And it was based on you turning a crank, and it fired. It would auto-fire after auto-loading all three components. The decision is based on something simple. Cased ammunition, metallic or paper-based, yes, that's a deal. Ammunition. Ammunition is defined as having a cartridge or casing that connects the primer, propellant, and projectile in that order. You have to initiate the primer, it sets off the propellant, and that pushes the projectile or projectiles. It can be paper, metallic, plastic, it doesn't matter. But if it isn't got a casing around it, or if some part of it is not really there, not restricted. Now we bring in pin fire and needle fire. Pin fire is a very strange kind of thing where the hole that on the top where you might put a, let's say, a fuse in, or in some cases a flash pan where it would ignite, flash, and fire some gases in to set off the gunpowder, they would just stick in a needle, a firing pin. And the hammer that would normally hit a cap or have a flint and steel thing would just slap it and then push in. And then you could pop it back out. And then somewhere in there, you'd put in from the muzzle a primer that would line up with that, and then pour in gunpowder and then put in the projectile. Or make an entire cased ammunition based on it. And then finally, the obvious thing, cut off the back of the barrel, make it to where it opens and you have a breech loader. And instead of a pinhole, you have a slot, and you just put a cartridge in with its own firing pin always there. It's a disposable firing pin. That's what a pin fire is. It comes in at an angle. Here's your bore, and here's the pin that it hits. And inside of the cartridge someplace is a primer or a cap, a percussion cap, that was stuck in there upside down. Instead of a hammer hitting it, you'd have a firing pin hitting it, acting as what's normally called the anvil. Now, a variation of this was to make a cartridge you'd throw down the muzzle that had all of those components, and it had a little firing pin in the back, and then inside of the breech, and again, this was a muzzle loading type, it would have a hammer that was flat that would come protruding out of the breech face and just go bap and hit that pin. Variation of this also included having an integral, really long needle that would go in to the chamber and hit the back of the cartridge. That was for breech loading and a muzzle loading version, just to make sure you hit it hard enough. And then finally, the one I'm bringing up. Needle fire guns implement a simple idea. You have a bullet that has a recessed area in the back of the bullet. It could be a flat bullet back, or it could have a cavity in the back to also hold propellant. Somewhere in there, either integrated as part of the bullet itself, literally molded into it or drilled in, would be a space where you'd put priming compound and then a metal object called an anvil, usually, but it would be called something else at the time in French, of course. And then you'd put in a paper tube, something easily burned off, very small amount of it, and then pack all the way around it gunpowder in a paste mixed with water. It would just be gunpowder mixed with water as a paste. Spread in there, and then a needle would come out of the breech face. Instead of a firing pin coming out this far, you get a needle coming in that would go inside of that recessed cavity in the bullet and hit that primer and set it off. And while the pin is being drawn back out, the projectile is being shot out, acting like a little rocket motor. Another variation of this would also just have a piece of bamboo or some other hard material that would still burn off or at least fall out of it, acting as a makeshift pin, being a pin fire, inline pin fire. And another variation just stuck the primer at the back. If the primer is exposed at the back and has something to hit against and go off in a reliable way, again, it was reliability and effectiveness, this would be regulated today as modern cased ammunition because it has the same sequence. But making the primer part of the bullet, which means the bullet and primer go out, or just milling the back of the bullet to where it has what looks like what would be the inverse of a primer pocket, and just putting priming compound in it where it'd be somewhat protected from being impacted from the outside, and making the entire bullet, the whole bullet shaped like a 45 Colt cartridge, making the whole thing shaped as a bullet, and having a needle go all the way in there to hit the primer. These are still not regulated as much. Now a little history. Belgian Army Captain M. Nessler. Some of you might have looked for this, and I'll try to integrate it in the top line of the video description. Drag stabilized short conical paper patched hollow base smoothbore musket shotgun slug. Up to 200-yard effective range, but only for shooting at lots of people in the Crimean War, where they're all lined up nice and neat in a formation. And it was a 66 caliber and something. You might have been able to, or tried to look up, Belgian Army Captain M. Nessler, or N.C. Nessler. The M. Nessler and the captain in the Belgian Army are statements made on the internet because someone doesn't remember where they found it from, so that may not be him. And the next thing is, Nessler became a meme. It's not something nailed down. It should be pointed out that if you look up N.C. Nessler, that's simply dealing with Confederate North Carolina as N.C. Nessler ball cartridges or bullets. And in that case, they just made a flat-based, ordinary big bullet. It didn't have a cavity in the bottom like the Nestlers that were in various militaries. But there is no record anywhere that I can find, period, full stop, for what Nestler is referring to. Now, I want to point out another one here. WB, actual initials, Chase Ball bullets. He made a claim that he made a new bullet design in 1861. The minie ball was made in 1850, and and M. Nestler is years before that. They're all progressive and evolutionary changes. But you might notice that Chase Ball claimed he made a new bullet design to extend the effective range of a smoothbore musket, 1861. And no, he just stole an idea. But it should be pointed out that if you try to look up any of this through the 1866 Journal des Armes Spéciales et Majeures of Coronard A.D. J. on page 270 or whatever, the Maritime Polytechnic Library or bookstore reference that is often cited here, it mentions nothing of this. This is a French document going on and on about how the Russian military people suck at being military because their infighting is getting in the way. It has nothing to do with any of these cartridges. None of these cartridge names show up in it. Read the description below to find out that this rabbit hole went nowhere. Same thing with NC Nestler. It just means North Carolina's version of the Nestler, which isn't anything different. Next, French Army officer Claude Minie invented a conical cavity-based conical front-lead bullet with 2 or 3 grooves and a 1,700-yard maximum effective range, over 1,000 yards. The first ball had a round cup in the base to jam up into the thing to spread out the skirt of the bullet so it would make more contact with the rifling. Powder exploded, cup forced the lead outward, filling in the barrel, and the bullet was now fitting snuggly into the anti-rifle grooves that were in the barrel, and also made it more efficient. This was the major thing, is it made it more efficient because it didn't have any blow-by. No matter what happened, as long as the barrel didn't generate a larger diameter towards the end, it would come out just fine. Now we bring up the modern version of the minie ball here. This is the 1855 minie ball image I'm looking at. It shows ball-altered musket. Weight of ball, 730 grains, powder, 70 grains. Another variation, 500 grains with around 60 grains of propellant, or 450 grains with 40 grains of propellant. And it shows 2 variations of this, where it had a conical base in the bottom, so it would do a wedge like that. You could also drop this projectile onto a wedge-shaped jam to jam it and force it into the rifling first. But that wasn't used much. Another one was more weaker. It had a bowl shape at the bottom of it that's exactly 0.22 inches for a flat spot in it, to try to make it even more nose heavy or something. For pistol and carbine, that one was 57 3/4 caliber until it was fired. Then it would go to 60. The other one started out at 68.5 literal paintball rifled barrel diameter with a 0.55 inch cavity at the bottom that would expand out to being 70 caliber or whatever. Variations of this can be fired out of 12 gauge shotguns. Now we bring the reveal. In each case, these things are no more than 1.05 inches long. And at that caliber, with that amount of dead space inside of them, modern propellant would work just fine to fire these, which means you could make a gun that literally looks like it's just holding bullets. Jam it into a breech loader, fire it, and because it uses a needle fire, because you've done all these things I've described, it would not be regulatable by the U.S. federal government or any entity for the most part, and would work fine. But then again, you could load it from the muzzle end by going doink, bang, and it would go off that fast because you're only loading, essentially, the whole bullet is the cartridge. 50% more bullet. Yes, that's a Portal reference. I just thought I'd bring this up. Links below in the description. Thanks for watching. Have a good day. Good luck with all that.